Ladies and gentlemen, this is a time for courage. Please welcome political activist Chloe Cole, 12-time All-American swimmer and Independent Women's Forum spokeswoman Riley Gaines Barker, and your host, President of the American Principles Project, Terry Schilling.
Wow, thank you guys all for coming. This is an honor for me. I am a father. I've got 6 kids. And what strikes me about this opportunity to be here at CPAC talking about this issue of transgenderism is that I'm with 2 girls that have been impacted by this issue from 2 totally different ends of the spectrum, right? We have Chloe Cole, who had gender confusion and had a whole other experience. And then we have Riley Gaines, an amazing athlete, who lost her opportunities. So we're gonna talk about all this, and we're gonna let their stories be told, because you guys get shut out of the media all the time, right?
Absolutely.
So Chloe, tell the audience just the quick story about how you developed the gender dysphoria and how you were taken advantage of, because this is really important.
Yeah, so I'm somebody who transitioned and detransitioned while I was still a minor. I started experiencing gender dysphoria when I was about 12 years old, and I started socially transitioning first by changing my name, the way I dress, the way I cut my hair, and my mannerisms, and then eventually I got diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And at 13, I was put on puberty blockers and testosterone, and I had a double mastectomy at 15, just after my sophomore year of high school, and I stopped transitioning at 16 years old.
Well, Chloe, I'm wondering, how was this covered by your insurance program, or did they have to pay out of pocket?
Yeah, so I'm from California, and by law, insurance companies are supposed to cover every single step of the transition process, pretty much.
And I'm curious, so they're forced to, by law, cover the transitions, but what about in your case, when you end up figuring out that you didn't need these surgeries and they took advantage? Are they forced to cover the detransition surgeries and treatments?
No, so I've reached out to the team of medical professionals who helped me to transition, and I haven't gotten any help with my detransition. I've pretty much had to figure out how to go through the motions all by myself. There's still a lot of unknowns. I mean, I'm having a lot of complications from the blockers, the cross-sex hormones, and the surgery, and I haven't gotten help with any of those. There's no standards of care for people like me.
That is so evil. The obvious thing is this is so evil. They lock them into this, and then they don't help them get out of it once they realize they're taken advantage of. But being taken advantage of is something that you experience in the NCAA competitions you're in. Can you tell people about the championship and your experience having to swim against a biological male, Riley?
Absolutely. So I graduated from the University of Kentucky last year, where I was on the swim team. I was able to accomplish some really amazing things in my career that I'm extremely proud of and will forever be proud of. But my senior year last year, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Leah Thomas story. Leah Thomas is a 6'4", fully intact biological male who swam 3 years on the men's side at University of Pennsylvania before switching to the women's team during his senior year. And so last year, out of nowhere, this person who at the time I had no idea was a biological male began posting the fastest times in the nation across multiple events. It was very bizarre. There was several red flags, one of which this was someone I had never heard of, which is rare in swimming, especially when you're competing at that top tier. And so an article was posted disclosing that Leah Thomas was formerly Will Thomas, and about 3 weeks before our NCAA championships, the NCAA announced that Leah would be competing with us. So that first day of the meet, I got to personally feel the effect that this infringement had on myself and my teammates. We sat on the side of the pool and watched Leah Thomas swim to a national title in the 500 freestyle, beating out 3 Olympians, American record holders, the most impressive female swimmers of all time by body lengths. And I want to add that this was a male swimmer who the year before was ranked, at best, 462nd in the men's division. And so that next day, Leah Thomas and I competed against each other in the 200-yard freestyle, which ultimately ended in a tie, which now, looking back, I realize kind of how God has moved through all of this. But we tied. We went the exact same time down to the 100th of a second. And so upon tying, we go behind the awards podium where the NCAA officials hand you your trophy and you're marched out and you're named an All-American. But we go back there and the official looks at me and Leah. We're about this far apart. And he says, "Great job. You guys tied. Leah gets the trophy." And so I look at him and I say, "Okay, I understand we tied and I understand there's one trophy, but what's your thought process as to why Leah gets the trophy?" And he said, "Well, for photo purposes, Leah has to have the trophy. So you can pose with this one, but you go home empty-handed. Leah takes the trophy." And so that's truly, of course I knew what was happening was wrong in regards to our unfair, or the disadvantage that we were at. And I knew what was happening in regards to the locker room, being forced to undress in front of a fully intact biological male. I knew that was wrong. But when the NCAA reduced everything that I had dedicated my entire life to, I've been swimming since I was 4 years old, everything that I have dedicated my entire life to, I was reduced to a photo op to validate the identity of a male. And that's when I decided to take a public stance and really just standing in the truth.
I am a little bit bewildered though. I'm confused because I'm told by the transgender activists that this doesn't happen, that we don't do these surgeries to little kids, that we don't have men competing against women. Chloe, what do you have to say to the people that say that this isn't happening?
I mean, we have clearly documented cases of this happening all the time. Like Jazz Jennings, they had a whole show about a kid who underwent sex reassignment surgery at 17 years old and started a medical transition at 8 years old. And I started medically transitioning when I was 13, and I went under the knife when I was only 15.
How much do these procedures cost? Did they give you a bill that showed how much it costs to get the hormone treatments? Or because I know that Lupron is a pretty expensive drug. And by the way, if you didn't know, Lupron is a drug that we've been giving to sex offenders to chemically castrate them for decades.
Right, and then we stopped doing that because it was deemed too cruel for use in sex offenders. So if it's too cruel to use in sex offenders, why are we using it on kids?
Why not use it on children? Great logic. Oh my gosh.
There are a few transgender activists on Twitter that are notorious, and they're freaking out right now, primarily because they're getting their butts kicked, right? You have 19 states that have passed laws to protect women's sports, to keep boys out. Tennessee, Bill Lee, just became the 9th state in the country to ban these surgeries and hormone treatments for minors. And so they're freaking out. And one of the things I saw recently, there are two activists that come to mind, Ari Drennan and another guy named Aaron Reed. They're both transgender, so they're males, but they try and do women face. They say that you two are committing genocide by opposing their movement. What do you have to say to that, Riley?
It seems as if we've gotten to a point in society where, well, it doesn't seem as if we have gotten to a point in society where we're denying basic truths. Man and woman is the sheer essence of humanity, and these people are trying to blur that line so we can't define what it is to be a woman. We have a sitting Supreme Court justice who refuses to say what a woman is. This is a problem, and this is something that translates far beyond my expertise of sports and far beyond Chloe's expertise. Look at what's happening in prisons. Look at what's happening, of course, within the education system. There's so many realms of life where they're trying to, they're pursuing this aggressive attempt to fully eradicate women as a whole, which is incredibly heartbreaking, especially being 22, sitting back here seeing this. I don't know if I was just naive before or if this is something that has been totally sprung upon us, but it's an attack, and it's an attack on women. It's the women who are at jeopardy here. Yeah.
Chloe, what do you have to say to these guys?
I mean, they say that I'm contributing to the trans suicide rate, but I've been speaking out about my experiences for about a year now, and in doing so, my goals are to stop childhood transition and to improve the standard of care for dysphoric patients of all ages. I mean, there's very little evidence to suggest that gender transitions are actually successful, and the standard for a successful transition is, well, the patient didn't commit suicide, which is a really low standard of care.
Well, in all seriousness, there are studies on this, and one of the most troubling things that I've found in these studies is they're not good, but they lose track of the people that they're studying within 5 years. Where did those people go? Did they detransition? There's a real propaganda effort against you guys.
We have no idea. We have no idea how many people detransition, how many of them commit suicide, and for what reasons, because it's all skewed. Mm-hmm. But there's a study conducted in Europe, done over the course of, I think, 30 years, all on adult patients who did a full transition, like hormones, surgeries, and they were actually about 19 times higher risk of committing suicide.
Riley, Governor Larry Hogan was on the Sunday morning talk shows a few weeks ago, and he lumped these transgender issues, the sports and all that, and he dismissed it as the culture war. And he says that we don't need to protect kids in schools from all this stuff. If he runs for president, he's not going to get in the culture. What do you have to say to these politicians? Because there's a lot of them, and a lot of them are in the Republican Party, the party that should be obviously opposing this. What do you have to say to the politicians that say that this is just a trumped-up culture war and we should be focusing on the fiscal issues and the important issues of the day?
Well, I've been going around to a lot of different states and testifying on behalf of women in sports, or fairness in women's sports legislation, and that is something I'm seeing, is when I go to these states like Kansas or Oklahoma or Colorado, which failed miserably, unfortunately, these Democrats, they say, oh, well, this isn't happening. We have 4 transgender athletes in the state. Why are we worried about this? We have other more pressing issues. First, that is not true. These states that say they have 4 transgender athletes, it is so incredibly underreported. You might have 4 transgender athletes on one softball team. I talked to a person on the plane the other day on my way home from Texas who said her daughter's team had 7 transgenders on her basketball team. 7, and this is in Texas. So it's happening. There's cases of happening all across college that are not reported on because these universities don't want to admit they have men on their women's teams, but they do. It's happening. I had a parent reach out to me. Her daughter's 6-year-old cheerleading team, and it's not a co-ed, it's a women's, or I guess young girls' cheerleading team, had a male flipping up and down the court. It's happening in masters divisions. I talked to a 65-year-old lady golfer who's competing against a man. And so to believe that it's a non-issue is so far from the truth. If nothing else, let's say Leah Thomas didn't solely transition to win, to change in the locker room with women. This opens a door to people who would fully be willing to take advantage of that opportunity. And that's what we're seeing, especially in regards to prisons, where we see these men who are convicted of terrible, awful crimes like rape and kidnapping and just heinous things. They're now identifying as women because it means they can get into women's prisons. It's more lenient, the charges are less. They're seeing this happen, and so just in California a few weeks ago, after seeing this be successful for few, over 200 males applied to be in women's prisons. Like, come on. We're taking advantage of the system that's already failing, and it's, again, only harming women.
Yeah. So, Chloe, there are a lot of parents in the audience, and I'm interested in this question as well, being a father. Where did you first learn about transgenderism or gender dysphoria? Right, because like as a kid growing up, I we didn't have this when I was growing up. So I'm just curious, like, how did this enter into your life, this entire concept of transgenderism?
I mean, like as a kid, I would hear it a few times, like from the adults speaking about it or from the TV, but I never really thought much about it until I started using social media when I got my first phone at 11. And I mean, I was pretty vulnerable to this because I had really bad body image issues from a young age. I started puberty at I think I was like 8 or 9, and the combination of that and having to deal with like the comments people would make about my body, and then going on social media and the internet at a really young age and like seeing all these really idealized images of women's bodies, just it was awful for me. And at roughly the same time that I started using social media, I started seeing a lot of posts that were in like video game communities that were, for some reason, there happened to be a lot of like LGBT identified people around my age on there. And eventually started seeing posts that were specifically about the LGBT, a lot of like information or really propaganda. And just a lot of posts about these people's lives, and I started noticing like a lot of these girls who identified as trans, they were quite like me. I mean, they were very tomboyish from a young age. A lot of them were like on the artistic side, and I felt like I could relate to them in a way, and it really touched me. And I eventually, after being exposed to this stuff for so long and so young, I started to wonder, like, maybe this has something to do with me, you know? Maybe I'm not a girl.
It's so nefarious. You said something just now about the body issues. And the thing that frightens me, so this transgender thing, it's a $2 billion industry right now. There's so much money. And they had a study that came out that said by 2030, they expected to be over $5 billion, just for the surgeries and hormones and all that. And you know where the projected growth is? All from women.
Right. I mean, in the past decade, there's been anywhere from a 2,000 to 4,000% increase in adolescents being referred to gender clinics, and that's mostly girls. I mean, before it was mostly adult men and prepubescent boys who had gender dysphoria, and most of those boys would grow out of it by adulthood.
We're getting to the end of this segment, so I just want to open it to both of you. We'll start with you, Riley. What are your closing words for America, right? Because this isn't just the conservative movement. This is America that you're talking to. The news is going to cover it. What do you have to say to everyone? What do you want people to take away from this?
My takeaway from what's really happened, I truthfully feel like since COVID, I feel like COVID expedited things. The pendulum has swung so far. I mean, like I said, we're denying basic truths. This is like a George Orwell dystopian novel that we're actually living in. And so my message to Americans, my message to parents, my message to young female athletes, it's so important to use your voice. It's so important to not feel like you just have to cave to the woke fads of today. Because speaking from my experience and talking to these athletes who are terrified into speaking out. I'm talking, we don't have time, obviously, but this is not just a fairness in women's sports issue. This is a freedom of speech issue. These girls have their voices suppressed like no other, but it's crucial we recognize what silence is, because silence is complicity. And when we're complicit, the left in particular is going to keep getting away with these things that the majority of the country is not okay with. So my message to Americans is to use your voice, stand firm in what you believe, and stand firm in the truth.
Chloe, any parting message?
I mean, the reason why we've gotten to this point now is that so many people have dismissed this as just as just being like a California issue, like such a fringe issue that it's not gonna affect me, or my kids or my family. But it's that attitude that's allowed this to fester. And it's made its way into schools, into institutions, because of this carelessness. But whether it's 10 kids or 100 kids or 1 million kids being affected by this, one is too many.
Absolutely.
Chloe, Riley, I just want to thank you guys so much for your courage and bravery. Thank you all for coming. Have a great life.
Thank you, guys.